Gary grabbed the microphone and shouted that I was confused, unstable, vindictive. Then I opened the Navy folder, read out the 401k loan number, the Liesel apartment lease, and the hotel charges in Oak Brook. The whole banquet room went silent. Even the bartender stopped moving. That was the night my husband learned the difference between a woman who is broken and a woman who has simply been quiet too long. But to understand how I got there, you have to come back with me to a Tuesday night in Naperville 3 months earlier, when he thought he still knew exactly who I was. Gary Mercer came home at 7:15 p.m., carrying the smell of cold air and expensive cologne. March in Illinois can't decide what it wants to be, and that day had given us sleet by noon and wind by dinner. He kicked off his shoes by the mudroom door, loosened his tie, and walked into the kitchen like any other night. I had reheated lasagna, store-bought, Stouffer's. The kind we'd eaten more times than I cared to admit once Rachel moved out, and it stopped making sense to cook for 2 people who barely spoke. The microwave had just beeped when he sat down. He still had his employee badge clipped to his belt loop. Regional sales manager, Midwestern Building Supply. His photo was 10 years old and kinder than his real face had become. I set his plate in front of him. Steam lifted from the cheese. He didn't thank me. "Tomorrow I'm filing for divorce," he said. Not angry, not emotional, calm as weather. Then he looked up and waited. That waiting was the cruelest part. He expected tears, bargaining, the old panic. For years, Gary had used leaving the way some men use a raised fist. He didn't need to hit anything. He just needed me to believe he might go. And for too long I did. I stood there with the dish towel still in my hands. My heart thudded once so hard I felt it in my throat. Then something strange happened. I got calm. Not happy, not brave, calm. I folded the towel, laid it on the counter, and walked to the hall drawer. Gary frowned. "Linda." The brass knob felt cool in my palm. Inside was the folder I'd placed there 3 weeks earlier. Navy blue, thick now. I brought it back and set it beside his lasagna. The sound it made against the wood table was soft, but in that kitchen it landed like a hammer. "What's this?" he asked. "You should open it." He gave a short laugh. "What is this, some kind of drama?" "No," I said, "it's paperwork." He opened it. First page copies of bank transfers. Second page statements from a credit card I didn't know existed. Third page records tied to a 1-bedroom apartment in Lisle. Then the consultation card for Marlene Ruiz, attorney at law. The color drained from his face in stages. He looked at me, then back down, then at me again. "You went through my things?" "I paid half for most of those things." His jaw tightened. "You've lost your mind." I almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, I pulled out my chair and sat down across from him. "No, Gary, I found it." He pushed the folder closed so hard a paper slid out onto the table. A receipt from a boutique hotel in Oak Brook. He snatched it up. "This means nothing." "Then tomorrow should be easy." For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. Not sad, not guilty, just uncertain. Men like Gary don't mind hurting people nearly as much as they mind losing control. He grabbed his phone and stood so quickly his chair scraped backward. "I'm calling Rick." His lawyer. He paced into the family room while I took a bite of now lukewarm lasagna. It tasted like salt and cardboard. I could hear him hissing into the phone. "She's been snooping." "No, she talked to someone." "Yes, tonight. No, listen to me." I chewed slowly and looked around the kitchen I had kept running for 23 years. Same cream cabinets we picked in 2009. Same crack in the grout near the stove. Same fruit bowl no one touched. Same clock ticking above the pantry. Everything looked ordinary. That was the strange thing about endings. They rarely arrive with thunder. Sometimes they sit down at your own table and ask for Parmesan. Gary came back 10 minutes later trying to restore himself. "You're making a mistake." "I might be." "You have no idea how ugly this can get." That line used to work on me. I would rush in, soften, apologize for whatever I had supposedly done. Tonight I just took a sip of water. "You already made it ugly," I said. He stared at me like I'd begun speaking another language. I wasn't always this woman. There was a time I would have cried before he finished the sentence. There was a time I believed every problem in our marriage somehow traced back to me being too emotional, too needy, too forgetful, too sensitive, too something. Gary was good at that. If he came home late and I asked why I was suspicious. If I noticed money missing, I was bad with finances. If I remembered a promise he broke, I was rewriting history. And if I got upset long enough, he'd sigh and say, maybe we should just divorce if I was that unhappy. Then I'd fold. I'd clean harder, cook better, speak softer. You can lose yourself that way without noticing. He stood at the sink, now gripping the edge of it. Rachel will be devastated. Our daughter, 27, living in Milwaukee, smart enough to know more than he thought. Then don't devastate her, I said. You think she'll side with you? There it was. Everything to him was sides. I think she'll survive. He muttered something under his breath and stormed upstairs. A minute later, drawers slammed, closet doors banged. I stayed in the kitchen until the lasagna cooled into a brick. My hands started shaking only after he was gone. That's how fear works sometimes. It waits until you're alone. I carried the plate to the sink and rinsed it. Then I opened the folder again and checked the papers for the 10th time just to steady myself. Dates, charges, transfers, notes in my handwriting. Facts had become a railing I could hold. At 11:40 p.m., the house finally went quiet. I took a blanket to the guest room. The mattress was too firm and smelled faintly of cedar from the spare closet. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan. Upstairs, I could hear Gary pacing. Back and forth. Back and forth. He thought the folder was the beginning of our war. It wasn't. It was the result of something that had started 6 months earlier when I opened the door of his SUV and smelled another woman before I ever saw a single receipt. When I opened Gary's SUV that October afternoon, the first thing I noticed wasn't a receipt or lipstick or anything dramatic like people talk about on television. It was the smell. Not mine, not our house, not anything that belonged in a 57-year-old man's car full of charging cords, golf tees, and old receipts. Something floral, expensive, powdery underneath. It hung in the warm air trapped inside the vehicle mixed with sun-baked leather and stale coffee. I stood there in the driveway holding my Costco list and told myself not to be ridiculous. Maybe a client rode with him. Maybe someone borrowed the car. Maybe I was becoming exactly what Gary always said I was: too suspicious, too emotional, looking for problems where none existed. I got in anyway. The passenger seat was pushed farther back than I keep it. A tiny thing, easy to explain. Still, I noticed it. I reached into the center console for a pen and found a hotel key sleeve. No key, just the paper holder. The Hawthorne House, Oak Brook, Illinois. My fingers went cold. I put it back immediately like it might burn me. Then I drove to Costco because habits are powerful things. I bought paper towels, rotisserie chicken dog food for a dog we no longer had because I'd forgotten Daisy died the spring before and had accidentally left it on the list from months ago. I stood in aisle 14 staring at the bag until a woman asked if I was okay. I said yes. I was not. That night, Gary came home cheerful, too cheerful. He kissed the top of my head while I was unloading the dishwasher. Gary hadn't kissed the top of my head in months. How was your day, babe? Fine. That one word nearly choked me. I watched him through dinner. He talked about inventory shortages, highway traffic, a guy named Todd who never answered emails. He ate 2 helpings of chicken pot pie and asked if we had ice cream. If he was cheating, he was either shameless or practiced. I said nothing. That became my pattern for a while. Say nothing, watch everything. Within 2 weeks, I noticed he never left his phone face up anymore. He started taking it into the bathroom. If it buzzed after 9 p.m., he'd walk into the mudroom to answer. He also became oddly critical. The towels smell musty. Why are we paying this much for groceries? You forgot to mail that card to my sister. I hadn't forgotten. He never bought the card. Small cuts, constant ones. Then came the money. Gary claimed commissions were down. Bad quarter, he said. Yet our credit card bill climbed. Gas charges in towns he hadn't mentioned, dinners in Geneva, Naperville hotels listed as hospitality, new shirts from Nordstrom. When I asked casually, he sighed like I was exhausting. You don't understand how entertaining clients works. Maybe I didn't, but I understood math. I told no one until November when Diane Keller took one look at me inside Panera Bread and said, "Who died?" I laughed too hard at that and nearly cried. Diane was 61, silver-haired, brisk, and built like she could carry a refrigerator if necessary. We'd known each other since Rachel was in middle school. We sat with coffee and broccoli cheddar soup. "What's going on?" she asked. "Nothing." "Linda." I stared at my spoon. "I think Gary's seeing someone." She didn't gasp, didn't perform sympathy. She just nodded once. "What makes you think that?" I told her about the smell the hotel sleeve, the phone, the spending. Could be something she said, could be nothing. That helps. It should. Means you need facts, not fantasies. That sentence changed me more than she knew. Facts, not fantasies. I had spent years living inside Gary's version of reality. Diane handed me a flashlight. She also handed me a napkin and said, "You've got mascara halfway to your chin." I laughed again, real laughter this time. The next week, I created an online login for one of our joint accounts Gary assumed I'd never touch. I had to reset the password 3 times because I kept forgetting whether I'd used an exclamation point. When I finally got in, I sat at the kitchen counter with my reading glasses and felt my stomach drop. Transfers I didn't recognize. Automatic payments to a property management company in Lisle. Cash withdrawals in neat regular amounts. I printed statements at the library because I didn't want a paper trail at home. On my first try, I accidentally sent 56 pages to the public printer. The teenage clerk looked at the stack and said, "Big project." You could say that. I paid $11.80 to learn my husband was lying. Around Thanksgiving, Diane insisted I speak to an attorney. "I'm not getting divorced," I said. "You may not be choosing it." That's how I ended up outside a brick office building in Downers Grove, gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached. Marlene Ruiz met me in a navy blazer and sensible shoes. Her office smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. I almost apologized for wasting her time. Instead, I sat down and told a stranger things I hadn't said out loud to myself. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked only practical questions. How long married? Any retirement accounts? Mortgage balance? Children? Whose name's on what? No pity, no drama. It was oddly comforting. Then she said, if he's planning to leave, he may already be arranging money. I felt heat rise in my chest. You mean hiding it? I mean preparing his version of events. That line stayed with me. On the drive home, snow started falling over I-88 in thin gray streaks. Traffic crawled. Christmas lights glowed on porches in neighborhoods passing by. I should have felt shattered. Instead, I felt awake. Gary was in the den when I got home, smiling at something on his phone. He looked up. Where were you? Out. With who? I paused just long enough to let him hear it. Why suspicious? He stared at me. Then he smiled again, but not warmly. That night after he fell asleep, I checked his jacket pocket while my hands trembled. Inside was a jewelry store receipt. No item listed. Just a total $1,284. I stood there in the dark bedroom, receipt in hand, and understood something cold and simple. This was not confusion. This was a plan. I wish I could tell you the affair was the worst part. It wasn't. Painful, yes. Humiliating, absolutely. But another woman was almost simple compared to what came next. Affairs are messy and ugly, but understandable. Vanity, loneliness, selfishness, stupidity. People have names for that. What Gary was doing to me had a different flavor. He was erasing me while I was still standing in the room. By December, I had a banker's box in the coat closet filled with copies of statements, notes, envelopes, and screenshots printed at the library. I labeled folders with sticky tabs because that's the kind of woman I've always been. If the world catches fire, I'll still alphabetize the ashes. One Saturday morning, Gary left early, saying he had a regional strategy breakfast in Schaumburg. At 7:12 a.m. On a Saturday. I nodded and asked if he wanted coffee in a travel mug. No time. He was wearing a new quarter-zip sweater with the tags still in the trash from the night before. The second he left, I opened our online retirement account. We had built that money slowly. 23 years of payroll deductions, catch-up contributions, canceled vacations, old cars kept longer than we wanted. It was the sort of account middle-aged people stare at when they wake up scared at 3 a.m. And there it was. A loan. Large enough to make my ears ring. I read the number 3 times because it didn't feel possible. Gary had borrowed against our shared 401k without one honest conversation. There was a note beside it approved November 3rd. November 3rd, the same week he bought a necklace for somebody else. I sat down so fast the kitchen chair squealed across the floor. That was the moment something in me hardened. Not my heart, my focus. Cheating was betrayal. This was theft from the future. I called Marlene on Monday. She didn't sound surprised. Print everything she said, and do not confront him yet. I want to scream. You can, just not before discovery. I laughed despite myself. After that, I became careful in ways I never had before. I copied tax returns, mortgage statements, car titles, insurance documents. I moved my grandmother's ring, my passport, and Rachel's baby bracelet into a canvas tote hidden behind winter blankets. Then came the second wound. I was at Jewel Osco when Mrs. Hanley from 2 streets over stopped me near produce. "Linda, how are you doing?" "Fine," I said. She tilted her head with that soft pity people think they're hiding. "Well, if you ever need anything, at our age memory issues can feel scary." I just stared at her. "Excuse me." She touched my arm. "Gary mentioned you've been under stress, forgetting things, mood swings. I shouldn't have said anything." She walked away before I found my voice. I stood beside a pyramid of Honeycrisp apples, feeling heat crawl up my neck. When I got back to my car, I locked the doors and cried so hard my chest hurt. Not because of the affair. Because my husband had been telling people I was losing my mind. That night I watched him butter toast like any other man. He asked, "Did you get groceries?" "Yes." "Remember the coffee this time?" I looked at him, really looked. He had become so comfortable with lying he could do it while crumbs sat on his lip. "Yes, Gary, I remembered." He smiled like a patient nurse indulging a difficult patient. I nearly threw the toaster at him. Instead, I rinsed my plate and went upstairs. Rachel called later that week. "Mom?" "Hi, honey." Her voice was cautious. "Dad says things have been tense." "Things have been tense for years." A pause. "He also said you've been overwhelmed lately." There it was, softened for the daughter, same poison. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and closed my eyes. "Rachel, do I sound confused to you?" "No, Mom, I didn't mean." "I know what you meant." She sighed. "I just don't want you two hurting each other." Neither did I, but one of us had started long ago. After we hung up, I called Diane. She listened for 10 minutes, then said, "You want me to come over, or you want me to help you bury a body?" I laughed so hard I snorted. "Come over." She arrived with tuna casserole and legal pads. We sat at my kitchen table while Gary worked late, supposedly. Diane helped me organize dates. Hotel charges lined up with sales conferences. Gas purchases lined up with Lyle. Cash withdrawals after payroll deposits. Then she pointed to a transfer I'd missed. "What's this?" I stared. "Another payment to the property company." "The apartment." I felt sick. He wasn't sneaking around in borrowed rooms. He had built himself a second life with monthly auto pay. Around 10 p.m., headlights swept across the front window. Gary came in cheerful, carrying winter air. Diane didn't know we had company. She smiled sweetly, just helping Linda remember a few things. For one brief second he froze. Then he recovered. "Well," he said, loosening his coat, "that's neighborly." After he went upstairs, Diane leaned toward me. "He knows you know something." "I'm scared." "Good," she said quietly. "Means you understand this matters." Later that night I heard Gary on the back patio through the sliding door speaking low into his phone. I couldn't hear every word, just enough. "She'll cry, she'll stall, then she'll sign." I stood in the dark dining room barefoot on cold tile, my pulse hammering. He wasn't hoping for peace. He had scripted my collapse. And for the first time I understood that staying quiet was no longer the same thing as staying kind. After I heard Gary say, "She'll cry, she'll stall, then she'll sign," something in me settled. Not healed, not hardened into stone, just settled. I stopped hoping he would suddenly turn into a different man if I found the right words, the right tone, the right moment. That hope had been costing me more than the affair ever did. It had cost me sleep, dignity, and years of trying to make sense out of nonsense. So I changed tactics. I stopped arguing. That was the first thing. When Gary came home and tossed his keys in the bowl by the door, I no longer asked where he'd been if he was late. When he made little comments meant to provoke me, I let them land and die. When he sighed heavily because dinner wasn't what he wanted, I said, "There's cereal in the pantry." The silence bothered him more than my tears ever had. But I did not become some icy movie character. Real life doesn't work that way. I still folded his shirts from the dryer because they were there. I still made grocery lists. I still put chicken in the oven on Sundays and reminded him the furnace filter needed changing because after 23 years, some habits sit in your hands, even after your heart stops believing in them. Maybe that sounds weak. It didn't feel weak. It felt like moving through the last rooms of a house before you shut the door behind you. The week after Christmas, Marlene had me open an account in my own name at a bank in Wheaton. I did it on a Tuesday morning with a young banker named Elise who couldn't have been older than Rachel. She smiled and asked if I wanted paperless statements. Yes, I said. My voice shook on the yes, and I hated that. Afterward, I sat in my car in the parking lot and cried for exactly 3 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when I started and when I stopped. Then I wiped my face, put on lipstick, and drove to Walgreens for printer paper and antacids. That became my life for a while, legal paperwork and stomach acid. Diane came over 2 or 3 nights a week. Sometimes she brought soup. Sometimes she brought yellow highlighters and a Sharpie, and the kind of matter-of-fact company that keeps a woman from drifting into self-pity. We sat at my kitchen table under the too bright light and went line by line through statements. Here she'd say, tapping a date. Oakbrook again. Or this one hit right after payroll. Or Linda make a copy of this and put one at my house. Marlene told me to preserve everything, so I did. Screenshots of account activity. Mortgage statements. Tax returns, retirement documents, insurance policies, a list of furniture my grandmother left me, even Gary's texts that sounded harmless until you read them beside the charges and realized he had sent working late don't wait up from a hotel bar in Naperville. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was staying ordinary while I did it. Gary grew cockier as the weeks passed. He bought 2 new dress shirts from Nordstrom Rack and a charcoal blazer he said was for networking season, whatever that meant. He started humming in the bathroom while he shaved. He spent longer in front of the mirror. One night he actually asked me if we had any stain remover for a lipstick mark on his collar, then caught himself and said it was pen ink. I looked right at it. It was coral pink. Try dish soap, I said. He watched me for a second as if waiting for a blow-up. When none came, he looked almost disappointed. That was the thing with Gary. He liked reactions. They fed him. My calm made him sloppy. Not always. He still knew how to throw me off balance. He had practice. One evening, Rachel drove down from Milwaukee for dinner. I made pot roast because it was January and bitterly cold, and because my daughter still loved the way I made carrots with too much butter and black pepper. She came in carrying a bakery box from O&H Danish and hugged me for a beat longer than usual. Gary was charm itself that night, helpful, warm, telling stories, filling water glasses. It made my skin crawl. Halfway through dessert, Rachel looked between us and said, "Can I ask something without you both getting defensive?" Gary chuckled. That sounds promising. She glanced at me. Dad said maybe you two were talking about separating. I set down my fork. Gary leaned back like this was all very regrettable and civilized. Your mother and I have had some challenges. Challenges? I could have laughed in his face. Rachel turned to me, Mom. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Marlene had warned me not to start a war before the timing was right, but hearing him perform concern for our daughter almost broke me. We have more than challenges, I said carefully. Gary's jaw shifted. Tiny movement. I saw it. Rachel looked worried. Are you okay? That question nearly undid me. Because what was the truthful answer? No, honey, I'm not okay. Your father is siphoning from our retirement and renting another place and telling people I'm unstable. Instead, I said I'm getting there. Gary reached for Rachel's hand. Your mom's been under a lot of stress. I stood up so abruptly my chair scraped the floor. I'm going to wrap up the leftovers. In the kitchen, my hands shook so hard I dropped the foil. I stood there staring at the counter, breathing through my nose, trying not to lose the plot. Rachel came in behind me a minute later. Mom? I kept my back to her. I'm fine. No, you're not. I turned around. Her face looked younger in that moment, almost like high school again. I need you to trust that there are things you don't know yet, I said. She frowned. About what? About your father, about this marriage. Her mouth tightened. Then tell me. I will, I said, but not tonight. She was hurt. I could see it. That stayed with me for days. The next morning I found Gary in the laundry room in his undershirt looking irritated. "Have you seen my silver cufflinks?" I knew exactly where they were. In the top drawer of his dresser, pushed under a stack of old church bulletins. "No," I said, pouring detergent into the washer. "I always keep them in the valet tray." "Then maybe they're in the valet tray." He tore through the bedroom for 15 minutes while I washed towels. He ended up wearing the plain knot cufflinks he hated. It was a petty little moment, but I'd be lying if I said it gave me no pleasure. Real revenge, at least for me, was not one long, clean line. It was legal forms and panic attacks and occasional tiny flashes of satisfaction that kept me moving. The panic attacks were real. One hit me in Marlene's office when she started explaining temporary orders, disclosure obligations, and how retirement assets could be traced. The room went thin around the edges. My chest tightened. I thought I might pass out. Marlene handed me a bottle of water and said very calmly, "You are not dying. You are overloaded." I laughed and cried at the same time. "Same thing," I said. "No," she replied, "not even close." By February, Gary had started dropping hints about a company banquet in St. Charles, a retirement dinner for one of the senior vice presidents, spouses invited, business formal. He mentioned it twice in the same week, casual on the surface, but too casual. Then I found the text. Not on his phone, on the phone bill. A burst of calls and messages around midnight with a number I already recognized from other records. Tessa's. The next day, while Gary showered, his tablet lit up on the breakfast bar. One preview line, that was all. "Can't wait till this is finally public after the banquet." I felt every hair on my arms lift. He was going to use that room, those people, that event. He was planning an audience. I picked up my coffee, though I no longer wanted it, and looked out at the gray snow melting off the deck rails. If Gary wanted witnesses, I thought, then maybe that could work both ways. By the night of the banquet, I had rehearsed a dozen versions of courage. In some of them, I walked in glowing and fearless, said one perfect sentence, and watched Gary collapse under the weight of truth. Real courage looked different. It looked like me sitting in my parked Honda outside the Fox Bend Country Club in St. Charles, with my hands sweating through a pair of black gloves, trying not to vomit into my purse. The parking lot was already filling. SUVs, sedans, luxury imports, license plates from half the western suburbs. Snowbanks along the edges had gone gray from road salt. Men in overcoats hurried women through the cold toward the entrance lights. I checked my reflection in the mirror. Black dress, pearls, light makeup, hair set the way I used to wear it for weddings and graduations. On my right hand was my grandmother's ring, the gold one with the small emerald. I hadn't worn it in years. I almost drove home twice. Then I thought of the 401k. I thought of Mrs. Hanley asking about my memory. I thought of Rachel repeating his lies without knowing they were lies. I got out of the car. Inside, the ballroom smelled like coffee roast beef perfume and money trying to look modest. Round tables covered in white cloth, a dance floor no one would use, centerpieces with winter branches sprayed silver, waiters carrying trays of drinks. People saw me and did that quick double-take people do when they expected drama and got composure instead. "Linda, so nice to see you. You look wonderful. How have you been?" "Fine," I said to everyone. Fine was getting a workout that year. Gary was near the bar with 2 co-workers when he spotted me. Even across the room I saw his posture change. He excused himself too fast and came over smiling through clenched teeth. "What are you doing here?" "You said spouses were invited." "We need to talk." "We're at a party," I said. Smile. For a second I thought he might grab my arm. Instead, he leaned close enough for me to smell mint and anger. "Do not do anything embarrassing." I looked at him. "Then don't give me a reason." He stepped back. Tessa Bloom was near the registration table pretending to review place cards with an event assistant. Slim black dress, blonde hair pinned up. Younger than me by at least 15 years, older than the fantasy I'd imagined in my head. She glanced at Gary, then at me, then quickly away. So, she knew who I was. I surprised myself by feeling almost nothing. At our table sat a few sales couples I'd known for years. Tom and Nancy Barlow, Pete Sanderson and his second wife Janice, a man from accounting whose name I always forgot. Small talk floated around us like lint. Weather. Grandkids. Interest rates. Gary became charming Gary, the version strangers loved. He laughed easily, touched my chair as he passed, asked if I wanted more water. If I hadn't lived with him, I might have believed him too. Dinner came and went. Dry roast beef, decent mashed potatoes, green beans no one touched. Then speeches began. The retiring vice president spoke first. Then the company president. Then, unexpectedly, Gary was asked to say a few words about leadership and the future of the region. Of course he was. He walked to the microphone smooth as polished wood. He thanked mentors, praised teamwork, made people laugh. Then he said it. Sometimes leadership also means making hard personal decisions with grace. A few people chuckled politely. He continued. This year has brought changes in my private life. My wife and I have had struggles for some time, but I believe honesty, kindness, and moving forward matter most. He gave a humble little nod. There it was. The noble man suffering quietly. The audience version of my marriage. My body went strangely calm. I stood. At first, only Nancy noticed. Then more heads turned. Gary saw me and faltered for the first time all evening. Linda, he said into the mic with a warning smile, why don't we talk later? No, I said, now works. The room stilled. I walked to the front carrying the Navy folder. You could hear heels on hardwood. You could hear someone set down a fork. Gary lowered the microphone. Sit down. I've done enough of that. A ripple went through the room. I reached for the spare mic on the podium and turned it on. My voice sounded steadier through speakers than it felt inside my chest. Gary says he values honesty, I said, so let's start there. He hissed stop. I opened the folder. November 3rd, loan taken against our shared 401k. Several faces changed immediately. People our age understand that number in their bones. Gary lunged for the papers. I stepped back. December through February, I continued. Monthly payments to an apartment in Lisle. Someone near the back whispered Jesus. Hotel charges in Oakbrook. Geneva dinners listed as client expenses. And while doing all that, Gary told neighbors and family I was confused, forgetful, unstable. Gasps are real, by the way. They don't happen often, but they do. Gary grabbed the microphone. She's twisting everything. Linda has been under emotional strain. I took one page from the folder and held it up. This is the lease with your signature. Then another. This is the retirement account transaction. Then another. This is a text bill showing calls to Ms. Bloom after midnight. Every head in the room turned toward Tessa. She went white. Gary looked at her, then at me, then back at the room. He had nowhere to place his face anymore. This is private, he snapped. No, I said quietly. Private was our kitchen. You wanted public. The accounting man at our table actually clapped once before his wife elbowed him. I almost laughed. Gary tried one last move. Linda, you need help. And there it was again, the old script. I leaned into the microphone. No, Gary, I needed facts. The room broke into murmurs loud enough to shake the chandeliers. Tessa set down her wine glass and walked straight out. Nancy Barlow folded her arms and stared at Gary like gum on a shoe. Tom suddenly found the tablecloth fascinating. The company president stood halfway, sat back down, then stood again. Nobody had trained for this. Gary reached for me, not hard, but enough. I stepped aside. His hand caught the water pitcher on the podium. It tipped, sending ice water down the front of his shirt and tie. A few people laughed before they could stop themselves. He looked around, wildly soaked and blinking. I closed the folder. You didn't want a divorce, I said loud enough for the room. You wanted an exit without consequences. Then I handed the folder to Marlena Ruiz, who had quietly entered 10 minutes earlier and was standing near the back wall in a camel coat. Best money I ever spent. I walked out. Behind me, Gary shouted my name. Outside, the cold air hit my face like baptism. He came running into the parking lot, coat open, shirt wet. Linda, don't do this. We can handle this privately. I turned to him. We could have, I said, months ago. Then I got into my Honda, locked the doors, and drove home while my hands shook the whole way. I thought I would feel victorious the morning after the banquet. Instead, I felt tired. Bone tired. 23 years tired. The kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and makes even sunlight feel like work. I woke at 6:10 a.m. out of habit. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then I rolled over, saw the empty side of the bed, and remembered all of it at once. Gary had not come home. I lay there listening to the furnace kick on and off. Snowmelt dripped somewhere outside the gutter. A truck backed up down the street with those 3 sharp beeps people hear in their sleep without fully waking. Life annoyingly continued. I made coffee. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it had before I blew up our marriage in front of 200 people. Same cream cabinets, same fruit bowl, same clock. Only now when the house was quiet it sounded like freedom trying out its voice. My phone started buzzing at 7:02. Diane first. Are you alive? Barely. She cackled. Nancy Barlow called me at midnight, said Gary looked like a baptized raccoon. I laughed so hard coffee came out my nose. Then Rachel called. I stared at the screen before answering. Hi, honey. Silence. Then why didn't you tell me? No hello, no warm-up, just pain. I tried, I said quietly. No, Mom. You told me there were things I didn't know. That's not the same thing. She was right. I sat down at the table. I was ashamed, I said, and I didn't know how much to say before I could prove it. She breathed hard into the phone. Dad said you humiliated him. He humiliated himself. Another silence. Then softer. Did he really take money from the retirement account? Yes. And tell people you were unstable? Yes. I heard her start crying. That was worse than the banquet, much worse. I'm sorry, she whispered. I thought maybe you were exaggerating. I know. I repeated things he said. I know that too. We both cried then, which was inconvenient because I had mascara on one eye and not the other. By noon, Marlene called. Do not speak to Gary without documentation, she said by way of greeting. Good morning to you too. He'll try to regain narrative control. Is that lawyer language? It's common sense language. She told me Gary's attorney had already reached out, sounding considerably more flexible than before. Amazing what public embarrassment can do to a negotiating posture. Then she said something I needed to hear. You did not win last night because you embarrassed him. Then why? Because you exposed facts he expected to manage privately. I wrote that down. The next week was ugly in less dramatic ways. Gary moved into the Liesel apartment full-time. He texted constantly. We need to talk. You went too far. You hurt Rachel. You made me look like a criminal. Then softer ones. Can we be adults? Remember Yellowstone? I miss home. Manipulation often arrives dressed as nostalgia. I answered none of them. But silence still cost me. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I missed the routine before I missed the man. The sound of another person upstairs. A second coffee mug in the sink. Someone to complain about weather with. Marriage can become a rhythm long after it stops being tender. I cried in a Home Goods parking lot because I couldn't choose between 2 bath mats and suddenly understood I was furnishing a life I never planned to live alone. I cried in the cereal aisle because Gary always bought Raisin Bran and now no one would. I cried because I was 54 and learning passwords, investments, insurance, deductibles, and loneliness all in the same season. That's the truth No Revenge Story likes to mention. Justice doesn't erase grief. Rachel came down 2 Saturdays later. She looked exhausted. We sat at my kitchen table with tomato soup and grilled cheese, the kind of lunch I used to make when she was sick in 4th grade. She stared into her bowl. Dad wants me to talk to you. About what? About being reasonable. I almost smiled. What does reasonable mean this week? He says you're punishing him. I let that sit between us. Then I reached over and touched her wrist. Rachel, listen carefully. I am not trying to punish your father. She looked up. I am trying to stop living inside his version of me. Her face changed. You could almost see pieces clicking into place. He always made it sound like you were difficult. I was often tired, sometimes angry, sometimes hurt. Those can resemble difficult when someone causes them. She laughed through tears. That sounds like something a therapist says. No, therapists charge more. We talked for 3 hours. About money. About marriage. About the things children notice but cannot name. About the night she was 16 and heard us fighting through a heating vent. About how much she loved us both. About how loving both people in a broken marriage can feel like betrayal no matter where you stand. When she left, she hugged me so hard my shoulder popped. Settlement moved faster after that. The retirement loan had to be accounted for. Hidden spending mattered. The apartment costs mattered. Gary suddenly wanted amicable closure, which is a phrase men often discover only after consequences arrive. I kept the house for 2 years with plans to sell later. I kept my share of what was mine. I kept my name clear. And more importantly, I kept myself. Months later, on the first warm Saturday of spring, I opened the kitchen window while coffee brewed. A radio somewhere down the block played old Fleetwood Mac. Someone was mowing too early. Birds argued in the maple tree by the fence. No dread sat in my stomach. No need to guess what mood waited behind a key turning in the lock. Just mourning. People ask if revenge made me happy. No. Truth did. If you've ever had to choose yourself after years of choosing everyone else, then you know how quiet that kind of victory can be. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it and stay with us for the next one. Thank you for listening.